our findings really align with your findings, so that's great. Obviously, our study was much larger. It was, continental, but very, very similar findings. So let me jump right into it. So this report that I'm presenting today is the second one that Africa and African NGOs conducted on the impact of COVID on African civil society organizations. Now, our first report, which came out in, I think it was June or July of 2020, really captured the impact of the pandemic very early. It was just like 2 months into the pandemic when we all imagined or believed that COVID would be over before 2020. So, a year and a half on, we thought it would be interesting to go back and see how the sector was faring. And so we also wanted to deepen our survey a little bit more to compare regions, compare countries, as well as sectors, to see if some sectors or some countries or regions were being more negatively affected than others. So our first report was based on a survey of 1,015 organizations from 44 countries. And then the second survey was based on was based on a survey of 1,039 CSOs from 46 countries. So just about the same, size sample. And this second survey was conducted in June and July of last year. And the report was published in October. So along with the CSO survey, we also carried out a mini survey of 26 funders of African CSOs to see how they were being impacted by COVID and what the implications are in terms of their funding and relationship with the CSOs that they support. So our report contains many important, many interesting, many worrying, but also encouraging findings, and you can see them as a summary of what we considered as the key findings. And now, obviously, we're not going to be able to go into and examine each and every one of these. And I think in just keeping with what I think is the focus of today's discussion, I'll just mainly talk about perhaps the impact on funding, particularly funding from institutional donors, such as mainly private foundations and INGOs, which are two of the, I guess, most important sources of funding to African CSOs. So first, and you can see it for yourself, I think this for us was really sort of the most critical finding, that the funding situation had actually worsened in 2021 compared to 2020, with 68%, slightly over 68% of respondents reporting a loss of funding since the start of the pandemic. And this is an increase of about 12.4% in comparison. Now, the loss of funding was most widespread among CSOs with small budgets, $100,000 and below, with 73.7% of them reporting that they had lost some funding. Now, while still significant, the loss of funding among respondents with budget expenditures above $1 million was less widespread. For example, only 40% of those with expenditures between 5 to 10 million lost any funding. Now, when we ask CSOs to predict changes in the funding trends in the next 12 months, about almost 60%, actually 57.2% predicted that the funding situation would continue to worsen. And another 5% went on to say that if the situation did not change, or rather improve, they expected to actually shut down altogether. Now, the loss of funding was happening at the same time as operating costs were rising. And again, 45.5% of respondents said that costs had increased compared to 34.9% in 2020. Again, and quite a, almost 10%, kind of 10% increase. Concurrently, about 40% of the CSOs experienced an increase in the demand of the services they provide. So it's interesting, you're losing funding, costs are going up, demand for services are going up, not surprisingly. Now, despite the fact that CSOs are sometimes the sole providers of services that fill gaps in government services, only 8.4% reported getting any government funding in response to the pandemic. Internally, organizations were also confronted with new challenges. The most striking new issue was, of course, around staff wellness. And I think Lou mentioned that. About 87.1% reported that there was increased anxiety and stress levels among staff. And thinking about Lou's presentation, staff were worried, am I going to get laid off or what's going to happen? So a lot of anxiety and stress among staff. Another 83% mentioned increased pressure and workload demands on the executive leadership. Yet only 64.9% of CSOs added any new measures to address staff wellness, with those having lower budgets being less likely to have done so. The impact experienced by CSOs, again, not surprisingly, had a cascading effect on the populations and the issues that they focus on. And when we asked them to describe some of these effects, respondents painted, quite a bleak situation. They described examples of, children and adolescents whom they serve being denied vital services, such as educational programs. They talked about life-saving medication for HIV positive people not being available, not being able to provide shelter for victims of domestic violence, etc. What is remarkable in this rather bleak story, of course, and you can see that from the numbers, is the perennial, we really see like the perennial resilience of African civil society organizations, because despite daunting challenges, over 80% of those surveyed reported that they had introduced new COVID-related activities. And many organizations were able to respond through donations by individuals, which is another remarkable finding from our survey, and further evidence of the invisibility of not only African CSOs, but also of African agency and giving. Another remarkable finding is that COVID-19 forced some funders to become more flexible and understanding in their grant-making processes. Our mini survey of the 26 funders revealed that many had relaxed reporting obligations. Some had converted project-based funding to operational funding. They reported listening to their grantees as to where and how best to support them during this uncertain and challenging period. So some kind of shift of power. To conclude on our findings, our data show a direct link between the size of budget expenditures and the ability of civil society organizations to weather the impact of the pandemic on their operations. But the historical underfinancing of African CSOs has made the sector extremely vulnerable to external shocks. And it has also starved CSOs of resources that they need to build robust organizational structures that can withstand external crises. So money matters. And it's not just the level of funding that's important. It's also the type and structure of funding, its duration, its purpose, its predictability, all these matter. And most funding to African CSOs has tended to be short-term and project-specific, which has meant that CSOs, at least local CSOs or African CSOs, are hard-pressed to demonstrate their impact because the activities lack continuity and are constantly changing to focus on donor priorities. So they leave behind few tangible long-term outcomes. So, being in this situation, this has been sort of the pre-existing condition of the African CSO sector, unable to sustain programs and to build track record of achievement. African CSOs often find themselves with a credibility deficit, even among those they exist to serve. When we ask both CSOs and their funders how funders can contribute to the sector's recovery and future proofing, they were in agreement and echoed well-known solutions. Khadija, can you give me the next slide? Yeah. There's nothing new here. I mean, we know funders should be more flexible. They should trust African CSOs, share power, support institution building, et cetera, et cetera. There are also things that governments need to do. Again, we know this, create an enabling environment, et cetera. And CSOs themselves also, there's work that they need to do. And they gave us, various examples of some of the things that they could do, some of the changes that they could make, that they have the agency and the capacity to change. So so if there's really nothing new in terms of things that funders should do, where are we finding the glimmer of optimism? That's in the title of our report. And where we're finding hope is really in this moment that COVID has offered, perhaps a moment, an inflection moment for things to change. What is new and unique in this moment is that COVID has also shown that change is possible. And what do I mean by this? It's the changes that we saw, and I think Lou alluded to some of those in his presentation. And one of the key changes, a very interesting, important change, is that many funders actually demonstrated that unprecedented flexibility. They provided additional resources, and in some cases, they actually ceded decision-making power to their African grantees. Now, these are steps that were unimaginable for many before the pandemic, but whether these changes will stay or not is still unclear. In fact, among the 26 funders who we surveyed, almost 50% thought these changes are temporary, and another 20% were not quite sure. Still, we're finding inspiration from funders who are showing the way. And as you can see from the slide that my colleague has just put up, this is just a quote from one of the funders who participated in our survey, talking about the changes that they made and how important those changes were in enabling their partners to continue to work. So the second place where we are also finding hope is in the response from African CSOs themselves. Despite, as I said, daunting challenges, they have demonstrated that change is possible. CSOs quickly demonstrated agility, creativity, with more than 80% quickly pivoting to add new COVID-focused activities to their programs. They also quickly embraced technology, Zoom and all of WhatsApp and all the rest of it, and found new ways of working. And I think Lou gave some good examples of those new ways of working. In this, we can say that African CSOs are exercising agency. They are also acknowledging challenges that are within their power to change and thinking differently about their operating models. And we've got two little quotes there that come directly from responses from some CSOs talking about collaborating more and even thinking about merging or amalgamating. So this gives us hope. And finally, what is different this time, we think, is that African CSOs are no longer the lone voice calling for meaningful change in the global aid architecture and practices. A constellation of voices, local and global, is growing louder in the call for change. We're even seeing, corporate foundations, bilateral funders, all talking about the need to change, how they have been engaging with African CSOs. Now, the extent to which, of course, this hope, the hope that this moment holds will be realized, of course, is going to depend on the willingness of those with power, especially funders, to act decisively and to act quickly to seize this moment. So I'll end there. And again, I welcome any questions to clarify anything that's not clear. I would be happy to do that.